The young woman who came to scrub the floors of Wrenfield Hall arrived on foot, in a grey wool dress with a carefully mended hem, carrying one small trunk that was far too fine for a housemaid, and a secret that could have unmade every soul who mistreated her before the week was out. She had left the hired coach at the crossroads 2 miles back, where the beech trees closed over the lane like the vault of a church, and she had walked the rest of the way on purpose, so that no one at the great house would see a carriage and wonder. By the time the chimneys of Wrenfield rose above the parkland, 9 of them, pale grey stone against a sky the color of wet slate, the hem she had mended so neatly was dark with spring mud, and her half-boots were ruined, and her hands, which had never in 22 years done a rougher thing than turn the pages of a book or press the keys of a pianoforte, had begun to ache from the weight of the trunk. She stopped at the top of the rise and looked down at the house that was to be hers, and for one long moment she let herself feel afraid. Her name, the name written in the parish register on the day she was christened, the name inked at the bottom of 104 letters folded and sewn into the lining of that too fine trunk, was Cordelia Ainsworth. Lady Cordelia, the elder daughter of a viscount whose title was older than the vines, and whose fortune had drained away like water through a cracked jug, until all that remained to the family was the name, and a daughter with grey eyes and a quiet mind. In 6 weeks' time, if the banns were read and nothing intervened, that daughter was to become the Duchess of Wrenfield, the wife of a man she had never once laid eyes upon. But she did not walk down toward the front door, where a duke's betrothed would be received with a footman at each elbow and the housekeeper curtsying on the step. She walked instead around the east wing, along the servants' way, past the kitchen gardens where the first peas were climbing their sticks, to a plain door beneath the scullery window, and there she set down her trunk and smoothed her ruined skirts and knocked like a girl who had come to beg for work. When the door opened, she gave her name as Cora Bell. She had chosen it herself. Cora because it was near enough to her own that she might answer to it without a betraying pause. Bell because it was a nothing sort of name, a name that belonged to 10,000 girls who scrubbed and carried and were never once looked at directly. She had practiced the accent on the long coach ride north, softening her vowels, flattening the music her governess had spent 15 years teaching her to make. She had practiced the curtsy, too, not the deep, graceful obeisance of a lady, but the quick bob of a servant who does not wish to be noticed. "I've come about the housemaid's place," she said. "I was told in the village there might be one going." And so Lady Cordelia Ainsworth, who in 6 weeks would be addressed by every man and woman in that house as Your Grace, stepped over the threshold of her own future household as the lowest thing in it, and let the door close behind her, and told no one who she was. She had her reasons. She would have said, if anyone had asked, that they were good ones. A year before, when her father had come to her white-faced with relief, and told her that the Duke of Wrenfield had offered for her hand, for her, the portionless daughter of a bankrupt house, a match so far above them it was very nearly a miracle. She had asked the only question that seemed to matter. What sort of man is he? And her father had not been able to answer. No one could. The Duke of Wrenfield was spoken of the way one speaks of weather that has killed men, with respect and at a distance. The Iron of Wrenfield, they called him in the clubs, cold, exacting, a man who had buried a first betrothal in scandal and never spoken of it since, and who now, at 29, wished to marry a stranger and be done with the business of a wife. Cordelia had done a strange thing then, for a girl in her position. She had written to him, Not the simpering, grateful letter her father wished her to send, but a real one. 3 pages in her own unadorned hand, about a book she had been reading and a disagreement she had with its author. She had expected no reply or a cold one. What she received, 11 days later, was 5 pages that argued with her and made her laugh aloud twice, and ended with a request that she write again. So she had written again, and he had answered. And for a year, a whole slow, turning year, through summer and harvest and the black of winter and out again into this green and terrifying spring, Lady Cordelia and the Duke of Wrenfield had known each other as 2 hands on paper and nothing more. She knew his mind. She knew the shape of his humor, dry as a struck flint. She knew he read Latin for pleasure and could not abide cruelty to horses, and had a scar on his temper where some old grief still ached. She had, though she would sooner have died than confess it, fallen most thoroughly and inconveniently in love with a man she had never met. And that was precisely the trouble, because a woman may love a man on paper and find, when at last she sees his face and hears his living voice, that the paper lied, that the wit is only clever, that the kindness is only manners, that the man who wrote so beautifully of not abiding cruelty is himself a small domestic tyrant, to everyone whose name is not worth writing to. She had seen it happen. She had watched her own aunt marry a charming letter and weep for 30 years beside the real man. So Cordelia had made her decision. She would go to Wrenfield before the wedding. Not as his bride, to be flattered and shown the best of everything, but as a servant, unseen and unregarded, to watch the man as he was when he believed no one who mattered was looking. She would learn whether the Duke of Wrenfield was kind to the people who could do nothing for him. And then, and only then, she would decide whether to become his wife. It was, she knew, an outrageous thing to do. If she were discovered, it would be a scandal to eclipse even his first. But she had spent her whole life being handed from her father's authority toward a husband's, a parcel of good breeding to be delivered intact, and this one reckless month was the only thing in all her 22 years she had ever chosen entirely for herself. She did not yet know what it would cost her. The housekeeper of Wrenfield Hall was a spare, upright woman named Mrs. Pruitt, with iron-gray hair scraped back so tightly it seemed to pull the very expression from her face, and a ring of keys at her waist that chimed with every step like a small, cold bell of judgment. She looked the new girl over the way a farmer looks over a horse he suspects has been doctored for sale. At the ruined boots, the mended hem, the hands that were too smooth, the neck that was held a little too straight. "You've the look of someone come down in the world," Mrs. Pruitt said. It was not a kindness. "We've no patience here for girls who think themselves too good for the work. His Grace keeps a hard house. You'll rise at 5. You'll black the grates and carry the coal and the water, and you'll not be seen above stairs unless you're sent for. And you'll not be heard at all. Servants at Wrenfield are furniture, girl. Good furniture holds its tongue and does not squeak." "Yes, Mrs. Pruitt," said Cora Bell, and dropped the little bob of a curtsy she had practiced, and thought of the letter in which the Duke had written, only 3 months past, that he could not understand men who measured their own greatness by how small they could make their servants feel. The room they gave her was at the very top of the house, up 4 flights of narrowing stairs, and along a bare corridor under the roof, where the beams came down so low she had to stoop. It was scarcely wider than a horse's stall. There was a cot with a flock mattress gone lumpy as a sack of turnips, a washstand with a cracked jug, a stub of tallow candle that would smoke and stink, and one small window thick with grime that looked out over the stable yard. In the night, the cold came down through the slates, as though the roof were no more than a sheet of paper, and the wind found every gap, and Cordelia, who had slept every night of her life beneath a goose-feather counterpane in a room with a fire, lay shivering under a single thin blanket and listened to the mice in the wall, and did not, to her own great surprise, say weep. She thought instead of the letters sewn into the lining of her trunk, which she had pushed beneath the cot. She thought of the last one, which he had ended, as he had ended each of them since the autumn, with the same 3 words, written each time as though they cost him something. I remain yours. Not your servant, not your obedient, in the empty way of correspondence, yours, as if he were already, on paper, hers. She had come to find out whether the man could bear the weight of that small word. She had not come to be comfortable. So she pulled the thin blanket to her chin, and set her aching hands beneath her arms to warm them, and made herself a promise in the dark. 1 month. She would give the true Duke of Wrenfield 1 month to show her his real face, and whatever that face proved to be, she would be brave enough to look at it. Below her, 3 floors down, in a room lined floor to ceiling with books, a lamp burned very late. But the new maid did not know that yet, and could not have guessed who sat beneath it, or what he held. She saw him for the first time on the 3rd morning, and it was not at all as she had imagined. She had built the Duke of Wrenfield in her mind 100 times from the evidence of his letters. A tall man, she had always supposed, with something forbidding in him, the iron of Wrenfield who made grown lords lower their voices. What she had not expected, crouched on her knees on the cold flags of the great hall with a brush and a bucket at 6:30 in the morning, was to look up at the sound of boots on stone, and see a man kneeling in the mud of the stable doorway with his fine coat forgotten, easing a splinter of iron from the hoof of a carriage horse, while he spoke to the trembling animal in a low, steady voice, as though gentling it were the most important business of his day. He was tall. That much her imagining had got right. Dark-haired, with a strong, clean jaw and a straight, severe mouth, and grey eyes set deep beneath a scholar's brow. A hard face, certainly, the sort of face that did not give itself away. But his hands on the frightened horse were sure and unhurried and kind, and when the old coachman began to stammer an apology for the beast having gone lame, the Duke cut him off, not sharply, but as a man ends a thing that need not be said. It is not your fault, Hobbs, that a horse casts a shoe. Walk him cool and poultice the hoof, and we'll have the farrier out. And put something warm inside yourself. You've been up since 4. Then he straightened and wiped his hands on a cloth the stable boy held out, and looked, for just a moment, without meaning to, directly at the housemaid, kneeling in the shadows of the hall, with her scrubbing brush suspended halfway to the floor. Cordelia dropped her eyes at once, as a servant must. Her heart was doing something foolish and violent behind her ribs. She scrubbed the same clean flagstone until he had gone, and told herself sternly that a man might be gentle to a valuable horse, and a cruelty to everything else that she had come to observe and not to swoon. That one kind word to an old coachman proved nothing whatever. But she had seen his face when he thought no one who signified was watching, and it had not been iron. It had been tired and careful and lonely. It had been, though she scarcely dared to think it, the face she had imagined behind the letters all along. Over the days that followed, she watched him the way a scholar watches for a rare bird. Sidelong, patient, from the edges of rooms, through the crack of a door left ajar, as she carried her coal scuttle past. And Wrenfield Hall, which was so quick to tell a new maid that its master was cold, began, without meaning to tell her something else. She learned that the Duke rose earlier than any servant and rode out alone across his acres in all weathers, and that the tenants he passed touched their hats to him, not with the flinch of fear, but with the ease of men who knew their rents would be fair and their roofs mended before winter. She learned that the schoolmaster in the village was paid out of the Duke's own purse, and that no one was meant to know it. She learned that the terrifying Iron of Wrenfield spent an hour every Sunday sitting with his old former nurse, now blind and half-deaf, in a cottage on the estate, reading to her from the Scripture, though he believed from certain things he had once written to a stranger, very little of it himself, because it comforted the old woman, and his comfort mattered to him less than hers. And she learned, on a wild night near the end of that first week, the truest thing of all. A storm came down off the moor after dark, thunder walking the hills and rain flung against the slates like handfuls of gravel, and word came up from the home farm that the carter's youngest child had taken a fever and gone into fits, and that the nearest physician was 9 miles off, across roads already running like rivers. Cordelia, sent down to the kitchen for hot bricks, saw the Duke of Wrenfield come through the scullery passage in his shirt-sleeves, wet to the skin, calling for his horse to be saddled, his own hunter, the best animal in the stable. And she heard Mr. Thornton beg him to send a groom instead, on such a night, for a carter's brat. The Duke had turned in the doorway with the rain streaming off him and said only, "It is a child, Thornton, and it is dying, and I have a fast horse and a steady hand. Would you have me sit warm by the fire and send another man to drown in my place?" And he had ridden out into the black of it himself, and come back near dawn grey with cold and mud to the thigh, with the physician up behind him, and the child had lived. No one was meant to praise him for it. He forbade it. He changed his clothes and rode out again to his rents at the usual hour, as though nothing had happened, and only a housemaid carrying coal along a cold gallery knew that the Iron of Wrenfield had spent the worst night of the spring keeping a poor man's baby from the grave, and had asked nothing and told no one, and plainly thought it not worth the telling. And she learned from the loose talk of the other servants over the servants' hall table, where she sat silent and below the salt, that the Duke of Wrenfield was to be married within the month to some viscount's daughter no one had ever seen. A cold arrangement, they all agreed, a matter of an old name and a settled estate, and that it was a great pity, for his heart was surely not in it, and what woman could ever thaw a man like that? Cordelia looked at her plate and said nothing, and felt the strangest tightening in her chest, half joy and half grief, because she alone in all that hall knew that the man's heart was in it, that it had been in it for a year, poured out 3 and 5 and 7 pages at a time, and that the woman they pitied him for marrying was sitting among them at that very moment, in a grey dress, with chapped hands, listening. It was Miss Arabella Frost who taught Cordelia what it was to be truly powerless. Miss Frost was the orphaned daughter of the late Duke's cousin, and she had been raised at Wrenfield since girlhood, as a kind of poor relation with grand pretensions, and she was, without any argument, the most beautiful creature Cordelia had ever seen. Hair like dark honey, a complexion of cream and roses, a laugh that could carry the length of a drawing-room and make every man in it turn. She was also, Cordelia came to understand within a week, entirely without mercy toward anyone who could not advance her, and she had decided some years ago that she herself, and no unseen viscount's daughter, was to be the next Duchess of Wrenfield. That the Duke had offered for another woman had not altered Miss Frost's design in the least. It had merely, in her mind, added an obstacle to be removed. And in the meantime, while she waited and schemed and smiled up into the Duke's severe face at dinner, she relieved her feelings upon the servants, and upon the newest and lowest of them most of all. She spilled a full cup of chocolate down the front of Cordelia's apron one morning, and swore to Mrs. Pruitt that the clumsy girl had jostled her, so that Cordelia was docked a half-day's wage she had never been paid to begin with, and made to launder every article in Miss Frost's dressing-room by hand. She sent Cordelia up and down the 4 flights of attic stairs a dozen times on invented errands, watching from the landing with a small smile as the girl climbed. She discovered that the new maid flinched at nothing and complained of nothing, and this composure, rather than satisfying her, seemed to enrage her, as though the girl's quiet dignity were a kind of insolence. "You look at me," Miss Frost said one evening, catching Cordelia's grey eyes on her for half an instant too long, "as though you thought yourself something. You are nothing. You are a pair of hands I have not yet troubled to dismiss. Do you understand me?" "Yes, miss," said Cordelia, and lowered her nothing eyes and thought, "I understand you far better than you know." For she had by now read the whole of Miss Arabella Frost, as clearly as if that lady too had written her 100 letters, and what she read there frightened her. Not for herself, but for the man 3 floors below, who did not seem to see the serpent he had warmed at his own hearth for 20 years. The moment that decided everything came on a grey afternoon of driving rain. Cordelia was on her knees again. She was so often on her knees now that the skin had worn to calluses, scrubbing the flags of the passage outside the library, when Miss Frost came sweeping past with a footman in tow, caught the corner of the bucket with her slippered foot, whether by accident or design, and sent a gallon of dirty grey water surging across the clean stone. Miss Frost did not stumble, but she rounded on the kneeling girl as though she had been assaulted, and struck her once, hard, across the face with the flat of her hand, a blow that snapped Cordelia's head to the side and left the print of 5 fingers rising red on her cheek. "Look what you have done, you insolent slut," Miss Frost said, breathing quickly, her lovely face transformed. "You have soaked my gown. I have a mind to have you turned out into the rain this very hour, and I shall have you. That will do, Arabella." The voice came from the library doorway, and it was very quiet, and it stopped Miss Frost, as though she had walked into a wall. The Duke of Wrenfield stood in the open door with a book still in his hand, and he was looking not at his cousin, but at the servant girl kneeling in the flood of dirty water, with the mark of a hand blazing on her white face. And his own face, in that moment, was the coldest and most terrible thing Cordelia had yet seen at Wrenfield. It was iron after all, but it was not turned upon her. "It was an accident, Your Grace," Cordelia heard herself say, into the ringing silence, before the Duke could speak again. She did not know why she said it. Miss Frost deserved every particle of his cold displeasure, and more. But Cordelia had seen, in the whiteness around the Duke's mouth, that he was on the very edge of a public reckoning with his cousin, and some instinct, some caution born of the letters and of her own hidden purpose, warned her that a housemaid must not be the cause of a duke humiliating his kinswoman before the servants. "I upset the bucket myself. Miss Frost was quite right to be vexed. I am clumsy, Your Grace, and I am sorry for the gown." There was a silence in which the rain drummed on the tall windows and no one moved. The Duke looked at her. He looked at her for what felt to Cordelia a very long time, at the red mark on her cheek that gave the lie to every word she had just spoken, at her grey eyes that met his for one unguarded instant before she remembered herself and dropped them, at her chapped and reddened hands folded in her sodden lap. "That is a generous account," he said at last, in a strange, altered voice, "of what I saw with my own eyes." And then to Miss Frost, without turning, "You will go and change your gown, Arabella, and you will not, while you are a guest beneath my roof, raise your hand to anyone in my household again. Not to anyone. Do I make myself understood?" Miss Frost went white, then red, and swept away without a word, and the footman fled after her, and Cordelia was left kneeling in the wreckage of the flood with the Duke of Wrenfield standing over her, and no one else in all the world to see. He crouched down, a duke in his fine coat, crouched down on the wet stone to the level of a housemaid's eyes. And this was so far outside, and anything Cordelia had ever seen or imagined, that she forgot, for a moment, to breathe. "Why did you lie for her?" he asked, quietly, only for her. And Cordelia, who had prepared herself for a month of playing a part, found that she could not, with those grey eyes on her, produce the flat servant's murmur she had practiced. "Because," she said, "a great man who breaks a small woman in front of others only makes himself smaller, and everyone in the room the poorer for having watched. You would not have wished, an hour from now, to have done it. I thought it a pity to let you." She heard the words leaving her mouth in her own voice, her real voice, the Viscount's daughter's voice, cool and clear and educated, and she saw the exact instant he heard it too. The Duke went very still. "Who taught you to speak like that?" he said. "My mother," said Cordelia, which was true, and dropped her eyes, and gathered up her brush with hands that had begun to shake. "If it please your grace, I'll have this dry within the hour." And she began, blindly, to mop. He did not go at once. He stayed crouched a moment longer, watching her, with an expression she could not read, and did not dare to look up and study. And then he rose, and she heard him walk a few steps away, and stop, and come back. "There is a fire in the library," he said, "and no one in it but me, and I find I cannot attend to my book, while a member of my household kneels in cold water in a draughty passage. When you have finished, you will come in and warm your hands, before you take another chill. That is not a kindness. It is an order, and you will obey it." And he went in, and left the door standing open, and the firelight fell out across the wet flags like a road. She should not have gone in. She knew it even as she wrung out the cloth, even as she pressed her cold hands for a moment to her burning cheek. A housemaid who warmed herself at her master's fire was a housemaid asking to be dismissed, or worse. But the passage was very cold, and the fire was very bright, and the man who had ordered her to it was the man whose letters she carried sewn into a trunk 4 floors above. And Cordelia had never in her life wanted anything the way she wanted, in that moment, to sit for 5 minutes in the warm and let herself simply be near him. So she went in, and that was how it began, the thing that neither of them had any business beginning, the thing that would either be the saving of them both or the ruin of everything. They did not touch, they scarcely spoke, that first evening. She stood by the hearth with her hands held out to the blaze, and he sat in the wing chair with his book unread upon his knee. And after a while, in the tone of a man remarking on the weather, he asked her what she was reading when she found the time to read. For he had seen, he said, that she read. A woman's hands told one thing, but her eyes told another, and hers had the look of a person who lived half in books. And Cordelia, who ought to have said she could not read at all, found that she could not make herself lie to him twice in one evening. So she told him. Not everything. Not her name. Not the truth. But she spoke of a book, and then of another, and he answered, and disagreed, and she disagreed back. And within a quarter of an hour the two of them were arguing, quietly, intently, wholly forgetting the fire and the late hour and the vast, unbridgeable gulf of rank between the chair and the hearthstone, about the very book, the very argument, that a viscount's daughter and a duke had begun, on paper a year before, in the first letters they had ever exchanged. The Duke of Wrenfield stopped mid-sentence. He was staring at the housemaid by his fire as though a ghost had risen out of the coals. "I have had this conversation before," he said slowly. "Word for word. I have had it with—" And then he stopped himself and passed a hand over his eyes and gave a short, disbelieving laugh at his own folly. "Forgive me. It is late, and I am not myself, and I have begun to hear echoes, go up to bed, and— Thank you. I have not talked so with anyone in this house in a very long time." Cordelia fled. She went up the 4 flights of stairs, 2 at a time, and shut the door of her freezing little room, and sat down on the lumpy cot with her heart going like a hammer, and pressed both her ruined hands over her mouth. Because she had come to Wrenfield to discover whether she could love the true face of the man behind the letters. And she had her answer now. God help her, she had her answer. She was not the only one who had noticed the change in the Duke. Miss Arabella Frost had spent 20 years studying Sebastian Vane, the way a general studies ground he means to take, and she knew every weather of his moods, and she saw, from the length of his silences at dinner, from the number of times his grey eyes strayed without his leave toward the door through which the servants came and went, that something had shifted in the master of Wrenfield, and that it had shifted in the direction of a grey-eyed housemaid with chapped hands and a straight neck. This Miss Frost could not allow. She had waited too long, schemed too patiently, endured too many years of being the poor cousin at the foot of another woman's table to lose the dukedom now. And to lose it, of all the humiliations the world could devise, to a maid. If the Duke was growing strange and soft, then the wedding must be hurried, not to the unseen Viscount's daughter, but away from her, and the unseen bride, the Lady Cordelia Ainsworth, whom no one at Wrenfield had ever met, must be made to seem so ruined and so false that the Duke would cast off the match in disgust and turn, in his wounded pride, to the beautiful cousin who had been beneath his hand all along. So Miss Frost laid her plot, and it was a clever one, and it very nearly served. Cordelia learned of it by the oldest means in any great house. She overheard it. She was carrying a scuttle of coal along the upper gallery late one evening, when she heard Miss Frost's voice, low and quick, through the half-open door of the small writing-room, and a man's voice answering, the voice of Mr. Pell, the Duke's man of business, a soft, ambitious, discontented person whom Miss Frost had long since bought with promises. Cordelia set down the scuttle without a sound, and stood against the cold paneling and listened, and the blood went to ice in her veins. For Miss Frost had learned, from a careless word of the Duke's, from a letter left a moment on a desk, that the Lady Cordelia was to arrive at Wrenfield within the fortnight to be married, and Miss Frost meant to forge a correspondence in the lady's name, letters full of another man, a secret lover, a child got in shame, and to have these discovered in the lady's own hand by the Duke himself on the very eve of the wedding. "He will not question it," Miss Frost was saying, with a soft satisfaction that made Cordelia's stomach turn. "He was deceived before, you know, by his first. He has a horror of a false woman that runs deeper than his reason. Show him proof that his bride is a wanton, and he will not stop to weigh it. He will break the match within the hour, and be too sick at heart to look at the reasons why. And then Mr. Pell, a grateful cousin who has stood by him, will be very near at hand, and very kind, and a man in that state is easily led to the altar by the first gentle hand that offers. You shall have your £1,000 and your place, and I shall have my coronet, and no one will ever be the wiser. Cordelia stood in the dark and understood with a terrible clarity the trap she herself had built. For the letters Miss Frost meant to forge would be laid against the Lady Cordelia Ainsworth, and the Lady Cordelia Ainsworth was standing in the gallery in a housemaid's apron, with the true letters, the real correspondence in her own unmistakable hand, sewn into a trunk beneath a cot 4 floors above. If Miss Frost's forgery were ever set beside Cordelia's genuine hand, the fraud would collapse in an instant. But only if Cordelia revealed herself and confessed the whole outrageous deception, and stood before the man she had come to love and told him that she had lied to him under his own roof for a month, had warmed her hands at his fire and argued with him over his own books, and let him believe her a servant, all the while carrying his letters and his heart in a trunk in the attic. She did not know that night whether she had the courage. She lay awake till the grey of dawn, turning it over. To speak was to risk his contempt. For what man forgives being made a fool of in his own house? To stay silent was to let a good man be broken by a lie, and led like a blind ox to marry the very woman who had broken him. There was no path through it that did not cross a chasm. But she thought as the window grayed of a line he had written her once, in the deep of the winter, when she had confessed to him some small cowardice of her own. Courage, he had written, is not the absence of fear. It is the ordering of oneself, in fear's despite, toward the thing one knows to be right. I have small patience with men who call themselves brave. I have all the patience in the world for the frightened soul who acts well anyway. She had loved him for that sentence. Now she would have to live up to it. She began quietly as her nature was, with small acts before the great one. She did not sleep the 2 nights following. She watched Mr. Pell, and marked when he went to the writing room, and one afternoon, while the household was at the far end of the park to see a prize bull the Duke had bought, she slipped into that room and found, in the false bottom of the desk, that Mr. Pell believed no servant clever enough to discover the half-finished forgery. 3 sheets in a woman's careful counterfeit hand, dated as though written from a place Cordelia had never been, addressed to a lover who did not exist, signed with Cordelia's own name in a copy so exact, it turned her cold to see it. Miss Frost had studied the lady's signature from some paper of the settlement. It was very good. It would have deceived a grieving man who did not stop to doubt. Cordelia did not destroy it. That was the hardest thing, to leave the poison where it lay. But she understood with the cold, clear part of her mind that had been her father's before the wine took his judgment, that a forgery burned proves nothing, while a forgery set beside the truth destroys the forger. So she left the false letters where they lay, and she went up to her freezing room, and she took her sewing scissors, and she unpicked the lining of the too fine trunk, and she drew out the whole year of the Duke's letters to her, and her own drafts of the letters she had sent him, 104 of them, tied with a grey ribbon, and she carried them down against her breast beneath her apron, and she waited for the 1 hour she knew she would have. The Duke rode out alone each morning at dawn, and returned each morning to break his fast alone in the small east room before the house was properly awake. On the appointed morning Cordelia was there before him, laying the fire when he came in booted and wind-blown from his ride. And she rose and shut the door, and stood with her back against it, and said in her own voice, the voice she had let him hear once by the library fire. "Your Grace, I must speak with you, and you must not send me away until I have finished, though you will wish to." He looked at her, startled. And then, because he had heard that voice before, and had told himself he imagined it, he looked at her a second time, harder, truly, as he had never quite let himself look at a servant. And something moved behind his grey eyes. "There is a plot beneath your roof," Cordelia said, before her courage could fail. "Against the lady you are to marry. Miss Frost and your Mr. Pell mean to forge letters in the Lady Cordelia's hand, letters full of a lover and a shame that do not exist, and to lay them before you on the eve of your wedding, so that you will break the match in disgust and be led, grieving, to marry Miss Frost in her place. The forgery is half made. It is in the false bottom of the writing-room desk. You may see it within the hour." The Duke's face had gone to stone. "How," he said, very low, "could a housemaid know any such thing?" "Because I heard them plot it, and because," said Cordelia, and here her voice at last began to shake, and she pressed the bundle of letters harder against her. "Because I am the woman they mean to ruin. There is no housemaid named Cora Bell. Your Grace, there never was. My name is Cordelia Ainsworth. I am the Viscount's daughter you offered for. I am the woman you have been writing to for a year." And she drew the bundle from beneath her apron and held it out to him across the little room. 104 letters, tied in grey ribbon, his own hand and hers, and stood trembling with her chin up and her tears standing bright and unfallen in her grey eyes, waiting for his contempt. For a long moment the Duke of Wrenfield did not move at all. He crossed the room. He took the bundle from her hands. His own were not quite steady. And he turned back the grey ribbon and looked at the topmost letter, which was one of his own, in his own black, decisive hand. And he turned it and saw beneath it a draft in hers, the very draft of the very letter that had first made him laugh aloud a year ago and think, against all his cold intentions, that he might not, after all, be marrying a stranger. He looked from the letters to her face, the grey eyes, the straight neck, the mark of Arabella's hand, a week faded on her cheek, and Cordelia watched the whole impossible truth of it break over him like a wave, and brace him, and change his face into something she had never seen there, something young and shaken and unguarded. "You came here?" he said. His voice was not quite his own. "You came into my house, as a servant. You scrubbed my floors. You slept." He stopped, and looked, in horror, toward the ceiling, toward the 4 flights of stairs, toward the freezing room under the slates he had never once thought about in his life. "You slept up there, in the cold, for a month. Cordelia." It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud, and it undid them both. "In God's name, why?" "Because," she said, and now the tears did fall. "I could not bear to marry a letter and wake beside a stranger. Because everyone said you were made of iron, and I had to know, before I gave you my whole life, whether the man of the letters was real, whether you were kind when kindness could win you nothing, whether the things you wrote to me were true. So I came to watch you as you are, unseen. It was a wild, wrong, unpardonable thing to do, and I know it, and I will go this hour and never trouble you again if you wish it. But you asked me why, and I will not lie to you a third time. I came to find out whether I could love you, and I have my answer, and it is the reason I could not let them break you. That is all. That is everything. And the Duke of Wrenfield, the Iron of Wrenfield, who made lords lower their voices, put the 104 letters down very carefully upon the table as though they were made of glass, and crossed the last of the little room, and took the frightened, weeping, unpardonable woman by both her ruined hands, and held them, and did not let go. "Say it again," he said unsteadily, "the last part. Say it to my face, in your own voice, so that I may hear it once without a sheet of paper between us." "I love you," said Lady Cordelia Ainsworth to the Duke of Wrenfield in the grey dawn of the East Room, in her own true voice at last. "I loved you on paper, and I was afraid it was a dream. And then I came and I saw you crouch in the mud for a lame horse, and read the scriptures to a blind old woman, and defend a housemaid you thought was no one. And I stopped being afraid. You are the man of the letters. You are better than the letters, and I would rather scrub your floors for the rest of my life than be a duchess anywhere else on earth." What followed Wrenfield Hall spoke of for a generation. The Duke did not raise his voice. That was what the servants remembered most, that he did the whole terrible thing quietly. He sent for Mr. Thornton, the old butler, and had the writing-room desk brought into the great hall before the assembled household, and the false bottom opened, and the half-made forgery drawn out and read aloud in the cold morning light, the counterfeit letters, the invented lover, the copied signature. And then he had Lady Cordelia's true letters laid beside them on the same table, in the same hand the forger had tried to steal, and any soul with eyes could see, in an instant, the truth standing beside the lie, and which was which. Miss Arabella Frost, when she understood that the grey-eyed housemaid she had struck across the face was the Lady Cordelia Ainsworth herself, and that her whole clever plot lay exposed upon the table in the daylight, went so white that they thought she would faint, and then began to rage, and then to plead, and neither served her in the least. The Duke looked at her for a long moment with an expression from which every trace of iron had been burned away, leaving only a great and weary sadness. For she was, after all, his kinswoman, and had been a child under his roof, and he had failed to see what she was becoming. "You struck her," he said, "across the face, in my house, for kneeling on my floor, and you would have broken us both to buy yourself a coronet. Arabella, what did we do to you that you should have grown so cold?" And he did not have her taken up before the magistrate, though he might have, for the forgery alone. He was too proud to make his house a public scandal a second time, and too weary to want her punished beyond her losing. He gave her an hour to pack, and a modest annuity paid quarterly on the strict condition that she never return within 40 miles of Wrenfield, and he sent her away in a closed carriage in the rain, and Mr. Pell with her, dismissed without a character. Cordelia watched the carriage go from an upper window and felt no triumph, only a kind of pity, and was glad, obscurely, that the man she loved had chosen mercy over revenge, even now, when revenge was so richly deserved. It told her, more than anything, that she had not been wrong about him. They were married 6 weeks later, on a morning of green-gold June, in the small stone church at the edge of the park, where the Duke's people had been christened and buried for 300 years. There was no great show, neither of them wished it, but every tenant on the estate came, and the old blind nurse was carried to the front pew in a chair, and the schoolmaster's children strewed the path with cowslips, and Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who had told a shivering new maid that servants at Wrenfield were furniture and must not squeak, wept without any dignity at all into her best handkerchief, and was not ashamed. And Mr. Thornton, the old butler, gave the bride away, at her own particular request, for her own father, sending his blessing and his relief from a great distance, had not troubled to come. And the Duke, waiting at the altar, watched Lady Cordelia Ainsworth walk toward him up the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, and thought that he had never in his cold, careful, guarded life seen anything half so brave. That night, and here the tale draws its curtain, as such tales must, and leaves the two of them their privacy. The Duke of Wrenfield led his wife, not to the grand ducal chamber, but first, up 4 narrow flights of stairs, and along a bare corridor under the roof, to the freezing little room where she had slept a month for love of him. He had it made ready with a fire and flowers, though it was midsummer and needed neither, and he stood with her in the low doorway where the beams came down, and he took a folded paper from his breast, the very first letter she had ever written him, worn soft at the creases with a year of reading, and by the light of the single candle he read aloud its last line, in his own low voice, at last, with no sheet of paper between them and nothing hidden and nothing left to fear. And then he blew out the candle, and the great house held its breath around them and kept, for once, its every secret. They had a long life, and a full one, and more happiness than most, and it was said in the county for 50 years afterward that the Duchess of Wrenfield was the only soul living who had ever truly thawed the iron of Wrenfield, though only the two of them ever knew that she had done it not with her beauty, nor her name, nor her fortune, of which she had almost none, but with a single reckless month of scrubbed floors and cold nights, and one grey dawn when a frightened woman found the courage to stand against a door and tell a hard man the truth. If this story warmed you even half so much as that long-ago fire warmed a shivering girl's hands, then stay a moment longer with me. Tap the like, so that more good souls are led to this quiet corner where the overlooked are seen at last, and the true of heart are chosen. And subscribe, and stay close, for there is another secret in another great house, waiting for the next time we sit together by the fire. Until then, be kind to the ones who can do nothing for you. You never truly know, my dear, who is watching.